I've kept and bred a lot of different species of finches over the years, including some that are considered pretty hard to breed. I think I've developed a bit of an eye for what they're looking for when they're wanting to nest. Although breeding condition is the number one factor determining whether or not your birds will be willing to go to nest, sometimes it seems like you do all the right things and it just isn't happening. Here are some techniques that I use that seem to be pretty successful. Obviously, if the finches aren't feeling secure, they're not going to want to go to nest. Here are some ideas of things you can do to help them. Develop a routine for interacting with them. Go feed them and change their water on a regular schedule if you can. Reduce any sources of stress that you can identify. Bully birds or overcrowding, maybe poor lighting or drafty airflow, things like that. Encourage them to explore their space and get used to different parts of the cage. Scatter millet sprays on the ground or pin them to different parts of the cage. Put water bath in one spot or a different spot and feed them in different locations. The more they explore, the more comfortable they get. And notice what they notice. Notice the things outside the cage, shadows, reflections, maybe squirrels outside the window or other birds. If they notice or alarm at anything that you can influence, see what you can do about that. For example, I spooked my firefinches off of their nest by leaving a hose outside the aviary. It was only by careful observation of their body language and alarms that I realized what I had done. The next category are a bunch of simple things that you can do to help replicate the natural behaviors or routine that your species of birds go through. If your species is the kind that likes to build multiple nest sites and have the female choose, then providing one nest site is going to be problematic. Sometimes they start building nests in their water dish or in the food dish just to provide alternative sites because that's what they're hardwired to do. Another thing to look at is the elevation of the nesting site that you're encouraging or providing off the ground. You can't always replicate this exactly, but you can make it seem as if you are providing the right elevation. Elevating the entire cage or elevating the nest inside the cage, usually in a back corner, are two ways that you can mimic the elevation in nature, but you can improve on the effect for the birds, I think, by adding foliage, either natural or unnatural, that makes it seem like the nest is in the canopy or the nest site is buried in the grasses, in a dense shrub, or even on the ground. This is where knowing what your species is naturally looking for is a huge help. Very closely related to elevation are the ideas of exposure and defensible space. What I mean by exposure is literally how light the area is. Is it bright with light foliage and exposure to the sky? Or is it a deep, dark, dense area? And I'll give you examples from the aviary because I think it's easy to see. Manipulating what the exposure is in terms of providing nest sites, I think, is a huge influencer over the birds. And then in addition to the immediate area of where the nest is, there's a space around it that seems to vary by species that matters to them as well. So that's what I'm calling defensible space. So a lot of my finches have about a 3-foot circle around their nest, which they consider to be very important. And that 3-foot area, for some of them, needs to continue to be deep, dark, dense shrubbery, or it needs to be open with good visibility, or it needs to have a perch nearby where they can hang out and guard the nest. And knowing what they are looking for can encourage them to nest and where to nest. Another thing to remember is that the birds will be looking for different kinds of nesting materials depending on where they are in the nest building process. Certain materials are used for structure, and these would be coarser materials, grasses, things that have the right bend or stiffness. And so having those available are important early in the nest building process. Then there's a lining typically, and that is usually finer and softer types of materials. And so if they can't find the material they're looking for at the phase they're in, sometimes that can interfere with the nest building. And then finally, we often try to provide starter nests for the birds, maybe a canary basket or a closed nest box or half open, that sort of thing. And sometimes that can be helpful, sometimes I think detrimental. I often get birds that sort of try to use them, but they're never really satisfied and they don't really settle down. So for most of my birds, they prefer to build their own nest. And I'm better off manipulating the environment that they're looking for so that they can build their own. The exception for my birds are those that are looking for a cavity to nest in, and that's very handy to have a nest box. So this is well documented by species, the kind of prefabricated nests that you can provide that are likely to be successful. So they're certainly worth a try. Okay, here's some examples from my aviary to to illustrate some of the ideas. My tricolor parrot finches always look for a high up location. It is not in dense cover, although the nest itself is sufficiently secretive. And there is always good visibility from the nest entrance out into open space. So you can see from these video clips, each nest has different structure, but the characteristics of the environment they're looking for is all very similar. So unlike the parrot finches, who are very good nest builders, the gold-breast waxbills are generally pretty sloppy nest builders, at least mine are. They're attracted to grasses, but they also like to be up out of the way and tucked up high in little hidden locations where it's nice and quiet, not a lot of activity. So they seem to do better with a canary nest amongst something that looks grassy. So you can see these hanging down elements. And the little dome that they build on top of the canary nest makes it be a more secure nest than if they built the nest entirely on their own. The chestnut-breasted mannequins have yet another style. Here's a clue as to what they're looking for, but it took me a while to get it right. They were attracted to very dense, dark parts of the aviary, and they had a large defensible space. I concluded that they might be wanting to nest in the canopy and defend the entire tree. That's not right. What they were looking for was foliage that they could fold in order to construct the nest. So they're not looking to gather nesting materials so much as they are to manipulate the site to create the nest. So here's my solution. A large cage inside the aviary provides them defensible space without creating havoc for everyone else. Extra foliage outside the cage makes that area seem more dense, and the foliage inside is all grasses and very flexible and bendy so that they can construct the nest site. And then fine grasses and strings and things are provided for the lining. The last species I'll talk about are the red-billed firefinches. They always seem to like to build fairly low to the ground. They seem to be attracted to very dense foliage, so a very dark and hidden space, but grassy foliage. They build a nice domed nest and are very good nest builders. Mine have always built several dummy nests, I call them, before they commit to a real nest. And they often build a dummy nest on top of the actual nest where the eggs are laid. They always seem to like to have a perch outside the nest from which they can both enter the nest somewhat cautiously, I would say, and also to keep an eye on the vicinity near the nest, which they defend pretty aggressively. One of the things I really enjoy about finches is watching them and learning how to provide them things that they're looking for. And so if you're getting stuck in the nest building phase, I would recommend doing some experiments in the categories of things that I've talked about in this video and just observe the birds. They pretty quickly tell you whether you're on the right track or not. Good luck, and thanks for clicking on the video.